Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining our webinar this morning. I'm Vicky Tung. I'm the Programme Manager for Futures and Innovation at the International Civil Society Centre based here in Berlin. And today I'm here with our researcher, Bertram Lang from the University of Frankfurt, who's been working with us on our China Futures piece under the Scanning the Horizon community, which the Centre convenes. For those of you who don't know the Centre quickly, as an introduction, we're owned by 15 of the world's leading international civil society organisations, and we exist to help strengthen the impact and resilience of their work. We do this by playing three roles. We're a sector convener, we're a platform for multi-agency collaboration, for instance, for inclusive SDG monitoring at the national level, and we also play a role as a knowledge and innovation broker, really trying to work with this key group of organisations to try and co-produce knowledge and share experiences on different aspects of our programming. Key to this is under our Futures programme, the Scanning the Horizon community, which is a collaborative learning platform for the global strategists from these leading international organisations to come together for peer learning and joint trends analysis. We've been going since 2015, and we have more than 20 members from the leading international CSOs, from national umbrella platforms and the private sector. This year, we've taken as the big trend for us to look at in greater depth, collaboratively, the implications of China's global rise on our work, particularly looking outside of China as well. The reason why we've picked this is that it's widely accepted that China's global rise is one of the 5 most influential trends on other global megatrends and how they're going to develop over time. We wanted to work with a group of organisations across a spectrum of pragmatic engagement and principled advocacy when it comes to engaging with global China, to really try and bring in the diversity of experiences and approaches from across the scope of our sector, regardless of whether the organisation has a direct presence, office or team in China or not. We've done this collaboratively because there are limited strategic resources within organisations to really individually understand the influence of this big trend. It's a huge and unpredictable topic, and really sharing current strategies and capacities together is really helping us come up with these recommendations to help guide future engagement and adaptation and identify practical entry points for senior leaders in our sector who may lack the time or knowledge to be able to engage deeply in the issue. All of the recommendations are documented in our new sector guidance, which we released earlier this week. So please go and see that if you haven't already had the chance yet. But it's really good that you have this opportunity to join us with Bertram, who is the main author, who can provide a bit more context on some of the recommendations and also give you a more nuanced understanding of where there was degrees of consensus, but also perhaps divergence of opinions and approaches amongst the international organisations that we worked to produce this new guide. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Bertram, who's going to talk you through the process and the recommendations for the first half, which is really focused on the organisational aspects and the collaborative sector aspects. Over to you, Bertram.
Thanks, Vicky. So hello again from my side, and thanks a lot for your interest in this background to the report, which has just been published. So we've been presenting draft versions of this report several times over the past weeks. Since the report is now publicly available, I will try to focus really on giving you a bit of background, so it's not too redundant if you have already had a look at the report. But of course, what you have written on the slides is also giving you more or less an overview of the actual recommendations that are in there. So first of all, as a background, a short overview of how we got where we are now. So we've been developing the sector guide from the meeting, the Scanning the Horizon meeting that we had in Hong Kong in June this year. Ahead of this, I was asked by ICSC to prepare kind of an input or several inputs for that conference on the trends that we're talking about in this report. For this, I did semi-structured interviews with a total of 22, both ICSO practitioners and also including some sectoral experts from different countries. After the conference in September, when I was in Hong Kong and Southern China, I also did additional interviews with local organizations. I will show you the relevance of this later on when we come to the sectoral recommendations. Additionally, since we identified together with ICSO, with ICSC and some of the organizations involved in the Scanning the Horizon group, those 4 trends, we did additional literature review and document analysis on those trends to also, of course, give you a kind of a context in that report on what is currently happening. Things are moving fast in terms of China's global impact, especially in many developing countries that have come under the Chinese label of the Belt and Road Initiative. So things are often moving more quickly than we can actually keep trace of. So we're just trying to give you an overview in that report of different trends which we think are the most important ones to monitor. And so, as I said, finally, this draft report or the draft recommendations have been validated with feedback from various actors, including from the Scanning the Horizon community, from our donor for this report, Stiftung Mercator, and also in October at an event organized by Stiftung Asienhaus at the Robert Bosch Foundation's representation in Berlin, where we actually had a European Chinese audience with also Chinese NGOs and government-backed organizations to give you some kind of feedback also from the Chinese side. Of course, this is still, to be sure, a very European or Western perspective, because we're talking about a group of ICSOs that have mostly been created in Europe and North America and Western countries. So the overall goal, I would say, is really, which arose also from the interviews with the organizations, is really to find a balance between constructive engagement with Chinese actors, especially in developing countries, because China's impact is so huge and so rapidly growing that we need to find constructive ways of working together for the kind of public goods that we're trying to achieve as ICSOs. And on the other hand, also to find ways of holding up our principles and trying to defend certain civil society principles against attacks and challenges that are coming from a clearly authoritarian government which is broadening its influence across the world. So we can go on to the next slide and show you the overall structure of the report, which you'll also find there, obviously. And today, so it's divided into some cross-cutting strategy recommendations and the 4 trends, which we call strategic pointers that I talked about. And finally, there's a short tools and resources section at the end, which gives you some links to organizations, network organizations, both Chinese and Asian, that ICSOs, especially those with fewer or less China experience and East Asia experience, can turn to find further information and also find contact points in the region. So today, the focus is going to be on the cross-cutting strategy recommendations, and this is going to be divided into strengthening organizational capacity, so for individual ICSOs, and sectoral cross-cutting collaborative recommendations, how the ICSO sector should work together on certain issues. So let's get started with the individual recommendations. Here we're dividing this into the recommendation to set up a specific global China strategy, into recommendations for how internal processes should be adapted to adjust to those processes, and finally into some communication guidelines, which I think is the most sensitive issue in a way for civil society organizations. So thank you, Vicky. So starting with the global China strategy that we want to get at, I think the first point, which seems pretty basic, but we think has turned out in the interviews to be really important, should definitely start with an internal global mapping of what is already happening concerning global China, especially within organizations that have a global setup, a representation in many countries, and where often those who did this global mapping found out that a lot is already happening on the ground, for example, in Eastern Africa, Southeast Asia, in terms of like informal engagement with Chinese actors, but also many everyday experiences with Chinese actors, which should be mapped and collected at a global level so as to know where the organization is actually standing. This cannot be done only by a China team because they simply don't have the global overview. So the goal should be to aim for a cross-cutting strategy for dealing with China's rise at an overall global level, which is entirely different from a China strategy in terms of how do we work in mainland China. So this is not what we're concerned here with here. There are many other resources, and often the people in the China offices know much better how to deal with the complexities of working in mainland China. Here we're really concerned with how we should adapt to the global impact of Chinese actors, Chinese governmental, but also non-governmental actors in other countries. And this, apart from a cross-cutting global strategy, should also include a regular China angle of looking at issues as in country and other country and regional strategies. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, but also increasingly in the Middle East or even in Latin America, where China's footprint is rapidly growing. You can move on, Mickey. So the second issue is, of course, a general and not so much China-specific one, but one that we found really important in light of what were recent experiences. ICSOs should be looking for opportunities to add value to initiatives that are already happening on the ground. This is also something that was really highlighted by community-based organizations, for example, especially those located in Hong Kong, many of which have actually been focusing on China's going out policy for 2 decades already. Especially labor organizations have been closely following mainland Chinese companies and their quest to develop overseas activities, and have been monitoring and also trying to engage with them for a long time. So ICSOs that are now starting to develop a global China strategy should be very much aware of those initiatives and engage with those local organizations, both from Hong Kong, but also from Southeast Asia, from also in sub-Saharan Africa. Civil society coalitions are picking up on the issue, or have been picking up on that issue for a couple of years now. So we think this is a really important point to reach out to them before starting to design any higher level engagement projects that don't include the local perspective. Then this is kind of a sensitive issue, I think, internally for many organizations. We think there should be some kind of mechanism for a regular internal reassessment in terms of the costs and benefits of maintaining, or if you don't have that, of creating or establishing a physical presence. So meaning mostly with a representative office in mainland China, but also possibly with temporary activities, which also need to be registered under the Chinese overseas NGO law. Why do I say this is sensitive? I think because often organizations tend to just continue a presence that has been established because it's been there, and it's hard to give up something. But we need to acknowledge that the situation within China has deteriorated for many civil society organizations over the past years. The overseas NGO law, which has come into force in January 2017, so has been enforced now already for almost 3 years, has been perceived by many organizations as an additional restriction, which is making their work harder. But it's not only about local, mostly about the implications for global activities. So what we've heard in many interviews is that increasingly the Chinese Communist Party is getting much more sensitive to any kind of even what we would see as constructive or differentiated criticism of Chinese activities, for example, in African countries in terms of like corruption risks, lack of transparency, human rights violations, whatever. And it has been repeatedly noticed in interviews that this can have problematic or negative implications for both activities within mainland China, but also actual threats to staff working in mainland China. So there is a clear trade-off in terms of the possibilities to speak up critically on issues relating to China, not only within mainland China, this is obvious, but also increasingly on a global scale. On the other hand, of course, even organizations that don't do their own activities within mainland China can have an incentive to establish an office there, simply because it facilitates the kind of like network building and that's necessary for engagement. There are some ICSOs that do have an office in Beijing simply for the purpose of building up connections with Chinese actors for activities in other countries. So there's clear advantages and downsides, and given the rapidly moving nature of Chinese policies towards civil society, we think there needs to be a kind of an established mechanism to honestly reassess those advantages and downsides for the individual organization on a regular basis. Then this is going into quite a different direction. So I should say, of course, that overall the recommendations are geared towards both purely service-oriented organizations and more advocacy or rights-based organizations, which of course means that some of the recommendations are only applicable to one type, although we've tried to balance this out overall. So this recommendation certainly is more geared towards the service-oriented organizations that do have a lot of experience of working in China. The potential of fundraising from Chinese donors has been highlighted by many China offices as one of the big trends for them over the coming 10 to 20 years. We're already seeing this now, that Chinese development funding is increasingly available, but not yet to overseas NGOs. So this is very much about thinking ahead. And another problem at the current stage, of course, is that again, the overseas NGO law formally prohibits foreign organizations from publicly fundraising within mainland China. So the Chinese government wants to avoid the kind of competition for resources between foreign and domestic organizations. Nonetheless, since this has been identified as such an important potential, we identified 4 possible avenues. So the first one, fundraising in Hong Kong, is more of a classic one, which has been done for a long time by many ICSOs. So there's no similar restrictions for doing this from a Hong Kong-based office. This is, of course, is not mainland China. The ONGO law doesn't apply. However, the future prospects of this are really disputed. There's some ICSO representatives seeing this as a growing potential, that even rich mainland Chinese donors may be willing to fund international organizations through Hong Kong organizations, because they also set up their own foundations in Hong Kong, and then the restrictions don't apply. On the other hand, what we've seen in recent months, of course, due to the increasingly difficult political situation and increasingly tense relations between Hong Kong and mainland China, that also Hong Kong-based donors have been less willing to give, especially for activities within mainland China, to ICSOs, but also more broadly to those ICSOs which they consider or which they criticize for not standing up to the Communist Party because of their stakes in mainland China. So there have been several specific cases, which I don't want to mention the names here, but it's also been reported in media that several ICSOs have come under severe social media criticism for not supporting the democracy movement in Hong Kong because of supposed fears for their activities within mainland China. So we see that there's kind of the future prospects of fundraising in Hong Kong are disputed. On the other hand, mainland Chinese internet philanthropy and online fundraising is a booming sector. This is massively increasing, and the potential for fundraising from individual Chinese citizens through platforms like Tencent charity platform or other big tech companies like Alibaba is clearly growing. So how to go about this? Formally, ICSOs are not allowed to fundraise, but there are several possibilities. So first of all, of course, you can support Chinese partners in fundraising here for joint projects. Events like Tencent's 9 September Charity Day, which is really has evolved into a massive thing in mainland China, can also be used not simply for fundraising, but for attracting public attention to important causes per se. And finally, one option is to set up a local foundation or a social enterprise, which then is a domestic organization, which is kind of a way of circumventing the ONGO law, honestly speaking, which is only recommendable to organizations with a very good standing in mainland China. So the one also publicly known success case by now is the WWF, who established the One Planet Foundation with the support of high-level Chinese and influential Chinese philanthropists. So this is certainly what's needed for this strategy, good local connections, and then this could be a viable option, which is also being explored by, as far as we know, 2 other ICSOs to date. But the legal framework is not entirely clear in how far this is officially meant to be allowed. And finally, looking at what we'll be talking about more next week when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, is that as Chinese companies are more and more Chinese companies have huge economic stakes in developing countries abroad, they're also increasingly willing to give out money to corporate social responsibility or philanthropy projects, if only for managing their own reputation. But here we have a couple of first-hand experiences of projects that have been tried out of cooperation between ICSOs and Chinese companies. Again, huge potential, but so far limited really implemented success stories.
Great, so that's the first main section, well, subsection. Are there any questions from anyone on that particular set of content? You can add it in the chat. Okay, in which case we'll move on to internal processes. Carry on, please, Bertram.
Thank you. So here, this slide is just an overview of some of the recommendations where I'm not going into too much detail. But in terms of processes, I think, as I said before, it's important to separate and just think strategically in a different way about domestic China and global China activities. And this, we think, should be reflected in a special role for a global China coordinator, which is different from the China office. So it can be, and in some organization it is, situated within the China or Hong Kong office. It doesn't have to, but it needs to be clear that there's one or several people who are responsible for the global China coordination rather than the domestic China activities. And these people really have to have good regular contact points, both in headquarters and in other regional offices across the world where Chinese influence is relevant. Then, secondly, I think this was pretty obvious from the conference meeting in Hong Kong, that since there's so much uncertainty about China's future trajectory, now we're all thinking about China's rise, but there are many economic problems, and especially the relationship, the overall political and geostrategic relationship between China and Western countries and many developing countries is highly uncertain. So ICSOs need to rely on scenario-based planning tools to develop different kinds of context scenarios for their activities, rather than just looking at one perspective. And thirdly, data security risks are kind of obviously a major challenge arising from China's technological advances, but kind of surprisingly almost never being talked about, at least in our conversations and at the Hong Kong meeting. So it's very obvious that if you have a formal representation in China, the detailed reporting requirements of the ONGO law make it necessary to share almost everything about your activities with the authorities anyway. Nonetheless, when it comes to activities outside China, this is a real issue. So apart from hardware issues, it's really about also how much and how to share information about other things with China country offices, in what ways, what to store within mainland China, etc. So these are is a large set of issues that comes with data security, related to data security risks. Then, secondly, one strategy that has been tried out by several ICSOs that I interviewed, and which has generally been seen as a very successful way of sensitizing and informing staff in other country offices who are not China specialists about the issues arising from China's internationalization, is to introduce secondment schemes in both directions. So seconding staff from other offices to China or Hong Kong offices for a couple of weeks or months, and the other way around, to build mutual understanding also of the often very different ways of approaching certain topics between the China offices and other country offices. So now we come to the last part of the first section, which is about communication strategies. I said before that when you want to maintain not only a physical presence in China, but good contacts with important and influential Chinese political actors, there's always a trade-off to be made in terms of how much you can openly criticize the Chinese government or the Communist Party, or even major Chinese corporations for what they're doing in other countries. This, of course, is easily being targeted as civil society self-censorship. So this is very obvious that this criticism is also coming from within the organizations, from other country offices, and possibly rightly so, but it's simply a trade-off that has to be acknowledged. And therefore, organizations need to establish some kind of internal comprehensive risk management strategy and agree between different regional and country offices how much they're willing to compromise to kind of gain or maintain the benefits that come with good contacts in China. So the ideal goal would be to have some kind of organization-wide protocol to guide internal communication, and also inclusive decision-making when it comes to specific declarations or statements involving Chinese actors. So imagine an organization doing a report on some mining issues with human rights violations in Central Africa that also involve the role of the Chinese government or Chinese actors. There should be a kind of a protocol of dealing with this, how to coordinate with the China office, how to work on the language, and also to maximize the impact, not only out of fear of reprisals, but also simply if you want to engage Chinese actors and Chinese companies in a constructive way, you'll have to do this differently than for Western actors. This is, I think, something that's quite obvious to all people working in the China offices, but not necessarily to those who are usually dealing with actors from other countries. And this is a recommendation that's related to this very issue. We also felt the need that civil society organizations acknowledge that if you want to have influence also on the kind of foreign policy strategy under the Belt and Road framework, if you want to co-shape this in a constructive way, then you need to do this in different ways and conceptualize your own ideas about impact, influence, and results differently in and for your China-related work. So first of all, this means that ICSOs should listen to what their Chinese partners are saying regarding what and how things can be communicated, and when talking publicly about a certain impact on a policy is positive in terms of raising awareness, or problematic in terms of threatening the very impact and the very relations, or even threatening to Chinese partner organizations, given the tense environment politically in China, especially foreign organizations which can easily be portrayed as Western foreign forces trying to undermine the Chinese regime, when those organizations claim to have changed Chinese policies or whatever. This can easily be construed as undue interference. So generally, I think it's better, if you want to achieve this kind of actual on-the-ground impact, to refrain from publicly claiming too much influence on policies or social changes, even if internally you think that you were able to make an impact. Then, of course, the challenge is how to deal with the kind of fundraising requirements where usually from donors visible results, attribution or contribution are explicitly sought after. So this is also kind of an issue that concerns donor-grantee relationships, about how to conceptualize this differently and how to also educate potential donors about the specific challenges and the specific ways of having to work on policy influence in China. Yes, and finally, so again, these communication issues, I think they all build upon similar assumptions on how to address and frame your policy recommendations if you want them to be more than just a principled statement for Western audiences, which of course for rights-based organizations is perfectly fine. This is not at all to say that there shouldn't be any severe and principled criticism about human rights violations by the Chinese government anymore, not at all. You'll see this later when we come to sector collaboration. But this is really, again, for organizations which are working with and within the system, and how to try to address their policy recommendations to maximize impact. So you can see what's written also in the report here. I think the first one is pretty obvious, that it's much better to present yourself as technical experts on a certain issue, to refer to own research that has been done. For example, if it's about negative social or environmental impact of certain investment projects in a developing country, having done actual research in that particular case and then going to a Chinese company with that expertise has turned out to be much more fruitful in terms of engagement than referring, for example, to second-hand reports, media, or even media reports, which are easily, again, construed as some kind of hostile action. Then UN language is generally a good way forward, because it's also being used by the Chinese government and the CCP as a reference, especially if we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. China is openly trying to portray itself as a country that is contributing massively to the Sustainable Development Goals, and using this as a common language in terms of goals that need to be worked together seems for us to be the much better solution compared to copying CCP slogans like, well, starting with the Belgian road itself, but also slogans like working for a community of shared future for mankind, or other CCP propaganda slogans. I think ICSOs should not go so far as to copy them simply in order to get attention. Then this, of course, requires good China expertise. It's often much more fruitful to specifically address certain government agencies that are targeted or that are already tasked with specific policies relating to ICSOs areas of work. So knowing also lower levels, local level policy plans or sectoral policy plans, and knowing the kind of language and kind of specific targets that certain government agencies are trying to fulfill is really a tried and tested strategy by Chinese NGOs, how they can work on the kind of differentiated interests within the system to find those actors they can actually collaborate and work together with. And finally, providing recommendations not in public reports, but internally through personal channels, or in closed workshops with influential scholars and think tankers is certainly another, again, also tried and tested strategy by many ICSOs if they want to feed information and new ideas into the system.
Thank you, Bertram. We have a question around the resources that are available for organisations on how to operate in mainland China. I know we do have the resources section within the main sector guide, but is there anything in particular that you can signpost as useful resources on that area within China?
Well, it depends what exactly you're looking for. So in terms of the legal and regulatory environment, I think one of the best overviews in English is clearly Asia Society's China File NGO project, which has been set up specifically when the overseas NGO law came into force, and which is tracking not only legal developments, but all kinds of like communications from the Ministry of Public Security, whatever they say on their WeChat account, for example, that has relevance for implementation of the laws, gathers all kinds of individual experiences by organizations, often in an anonymous way, in order to just build this kind of resources pool. So this would be my my first go-to resource. If it's about official policies, there's also a China NPO platform, which is run by Chinese government authorities and traces all the regulatory development and is specifically set up for civil society organizations to refer to. So if it's purely about the official information, that's also a good resource. Then there are many others, but as I said, this report is not concerned with the within mainland China issues, which also simply requires a lot of like individual expertise. I think you cannot approach or try to build a presence or in any legal form in China without having people within the organizations that have a long working experience and a good working experience in and with in China and with Chinese actors.
Great, thanks. So now there don't seem to be any more questions on the organisational aspect. So let's move on to the collaborative sector opportunities that you've identified.
Yes, so here, as I said in the beginning, the difference is that those recommendations are targeted towards ICSOs acting collectively. So it's about things which individual organizations, from our experience, our understanding, but also from the discussions in Hong Kong, cannot achieve on their own. So the first one is that the kind of horizon scanning capacity that is necessary to understand the longer term trends of China's impact, often they require long-term thinking, and this is precisely the kind of resources which are usually very scarce in ICSOs. So pooling resources to commission studies, commission specific analysis on trends of common interest and common concern is a very important step forward. And more institutionally, we hope that all of this that ICC has done throughout the year will be conducive to kind of a setup of a more, well, at least an informal trend scanning network where ICSOs can share their resources, updates, and existing analysis on China, simply to avoid duplication and be more efficient in those mid and longer term assessments. Then the second issue, which may be much more sensitive, but also much more specific in a way, is to find ways for strategically combining insider and outsider strategies to maximize impact on certain policy issues. So as I said before, there is a choice to be made by individual organizations whether you want to maintain or create a physical presence in mainland China with all the limitations, but also all the potential that come with it, or whether you want to work on China issues as an outsider without that presence. But of course, we need, as a collective sector, we need both types of organizations in any field. And I think one field in which this strategic combination and corporations working quite well is the environmental sector in terms of monitoring, but also trying to influence Chinese foreign policy and Chinese regulations in terms of improving impact assessments, better regulations for protecting environment or protecting the environment in Chinese overseas investments. So a combination of ICSOs that exert external pressure by doing their own independent assessments and publishing them, and those organizations which are which have a presence in mainland China and work directly with the actors responsible for drafting the regulations and also implementing them. And this can range from like just regular information exchange between those ICSOs all the way to strategic advocacy campaigns, which then of course become kind of a sensitive issue. We cannot go into detail here because it's potentially problematic from the for the insider organizations. But I think there's a lot of potential of like combining this without losing the kind of principled and open critical statements that we need from civil society organizations on negative issues, just as for any other, or just as for overseas investments from any other country. We need a critical assessment and critical independent analysis of the impact of Chinese investments overseas. And then the second aspect of this is also to increasingly reach out to organizations which don't have a China focus but work on the same issues, because now in the Scanning the Horizon group, I think most organizations that were in that group and that participated in Hong Kong already do have this kind of sensitivity for global China issues, but there are many other civil society organizations that are working also in developing countries which kind of continue to feel unconcerned or just don't consider themselves as having a China focus, but could play a very important role if sector collaboration were to be improved. Then another issue is connecting dots from different levels. So at the UN, as you saw, if you looked at the report, one of the 4 trends we identified is China's growing influence on global governance issues, and particularly on within the United Nations system. And this is already being tracked to some extent by informal roundtables of ICSOs at the UN level, but also at other international organizations. What's lacking is a regular knowledge transfer between the experiences of those representative offices at the UN and the China East Asia desks, which remain kind of aloof from those global governance developments. And on the other hand, UN representative offices are often not staffed with enough China experts to create this kind of constructive linkage. And the second issue here is to promote staff meetings. So staff meetings both between ICSOs, but also between ICSOs and local community-based NGOs, civil society organizations in Belt and Road focused countries. For example, Myanmar, increasingly Ethiopia, Kenya, etc., where this would be really fruitful to put together the local experience and local expertise on the ways China is shaping development, the kind of problematic aspects that need to be targeted, as well as the potential for engagement. Then, when we look to development finance, again, this is treated more broadly in the second webinar next week. But the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was created upon Chinese initiative, but as a multilateral development bank with significant representation of European staff in high-level positions, is generally seen as the one Chinese-sponsored development actor that's the most accessible, whereas unilateral Chinese development banks, policy banks, continue to be very closed and very difficult to access, especially for foreign civil society organizations, but for Chinese civil society as well. So the AIIB could really be the one case or the one model case where both both Chinese and international civil society organizations work together to improve their access to decision makers, to their influence on investment decisions, and to at the same time not only change the AIIB's investment policies into better respecting environmental and social inclusiveness standards, but also building trust with both Chinese NGOs and Chinese development finance experts at the same time. Then this is based on what I said before on the fundraising side. Clearly, Chinese companies, and this includes both state-owned enterprises and private companies, are very important actors in many developing countries that ICSOs are working in. What's lacking for now is the kind of good, comprehensive success stories of engagement that's working with a positive impact on the ground, but it is also, and this clearly needs to be there, that's showing the kind of benefits for the companies themselves, because otherwise I think this is very much the same for European or American companies. If the companies themselves don't see the benefits of cooperating with civil society organizations, they will not continue this in a meaningful way. So one idea would be to work together as an ICSO community and really pilot and jointly promote this kinds of models of cooperation with some of the more open companies, and present those positive examples as a positive incentive, so that companies can also see this actually has reputational benefits, rather than just seeing ICSOs as those nasty organizations that criticize their behavior all the time. Then, as I said before, East Asian civil society organizations and networks, such as the Asian Monetary Resource Center, the NGO Forum on the ADB, and other multilateral regional networks that already have been around for quite some time, are really important partners for Western-based or Western-originated civil society organizations. And so this kind of cooperation and exchanges should also be massively increased with a specific focus on China advocacy issues at a sectoral level, and not only between individual organizations. And the goal being, of course, to avoid duplication or even replacement of this work of often smaller and less well-resourced organizations in the region by ICSOs from outside. There's clearly also the problem of competition for resources that's always in the background. But if we want to maximize our positive social impact, I think this has to be thought about. And this was also highlighted, I think, after the June meeting by Hong Kong-based civil society organizations, that they feel there needs to be more regular and not only this one-off dialogue between those globally oriented ICSOs and the more regionally or locally focused civil society organizations that they represent. And finally, we try to identify those areas, like those sectors and issues around which we think more concerted sectoral engagement with Chinese actors, and this includes government actors, private sector actors, as well as non-governmental actors, so foundations, charities, and Chinese NGOs, where this kind of engagement is deemed both necessary. I think necessary, there are many sectors, but also promising in terms of getting a constructive and positive response from Chinese actors. And you can see the overview of those issues here. I think in terms of climate crisis mitigation and adaptation, this is very obviously one issue where Beijing is trying to position itself as a global leader, especially after the United States has kind of abandoned any ambition to that role. There's a huge gap here for China to be filled, and huge potential for them in terms of improving their reputation, which does mean, apart from the propaganda aspect, which does mean that there's actual willingness to improve and compromise. The same goes for, as I said, for environmental assessments of Chinese overseas investments. So this also means that NGOs from China to have much more leeway on those issues, also acting internationally and entering into international, transnational cooperation on those issues than they have in other areas. The second issue, reducing inequalities in development, was highlighted and discussed as kind of a way of framing or bringing together two disconnected frames, but which kind of aim at similar issues. So the Chinese government, of course, prides itself on the kind of absolute poverty alleviation that it has achieved domestically and which it presents as a model for other developing countries. But rather than just following this official discourse and this being like a only supporting Chinese official propaganda, if we focus on inequalities in development more broadly, this could be a way of including or reconciling this Chinese official discourse with issues that are at the heart of many ICSOs missions anyway. And finally, incremental improvements to the framework for monitoring, assessing the impact of overseas development finance from China is something that several ICSOs are already working on and which definitely has the potential to be further improved. We've already seen that regulatory frameworks for overseas investments have improved at both the central level and local levels in China. However, implementation is really the major issue. So this is also something where ICSOs can sensibly go to Chinese government authorities and tell them that they're basically helping them with the implementation of policies which would massively improve or attenuate the negative impacts or the negative side effects of Chinese investments in developing countries.
Thank you, Bertram. Speaking of that, we do have a question around that, highlighting that local CSOs in the Global South are already collaborating between them and amongst themselves to address the impact of Chinese investment in their countries. Could you say a bit more about how you see the collaboration with international CSOs and local CSOs? Whether is it possible? Is it desirable? What might it look like? And what are the different strengths and value that both sets of actors bring?
I mean, honestly, seeing who that question is from, I think if you're asking that question, you're probably a better expert than I am on those specific issues. I don't know if you want to jump in with your own opinion on that. I know a couple of projects that you've been doing in that field. I don't know if you want to jump in or have me give a more general, higher level assessment of that.
Okay, is there anyone else on the webinar who would like to speak to that particular issue? I am aware that we only have a few minutes left, but if you would like to kind of share any insights on that, please do either write in the chat or unmute yourself.
I mean, we've had a couple of issues being discussed also at the meeting in Hong Kong. For example, when it comes to introducing methods of collective bargaining within overseas representations of Chinese companies, where often local unions or local NGOs working together with unions have already had or made efforts to do so with those Chinese companies and have established contacts within those companies previously. But international organizations can bring in both their expertise from other locations and, of course, have much more potential to scale up certain success cases from the local level to other companies, but also to other sites, to other factories within companies. So I think this is just one example where if coordination works well, local level experiences can be combined with the kind of global outreach. Knowing full well, of course, that many of the ICSOs we have in the community are not only Western and global organizations, but they're federated organizations with many local implantations. So I don't want to minimize the kind of local expertise and the kind of local implantation that many of those organizations do have. But for others, often they tend to look at it more from a overall global level. And maybe in many countries, especially those countries with very high Chinese investment, often Western civil society organizations have less of a sustained presence and experience.
Thank you, Bertram. We are out of time. I think that's a really important discussion that we would like to see continued. Just finally, some more chances to engage. We are back at the same time next week to look at the part 2, which will focus on the strategic pointers. You can either catch it live and register on our website or catch it later on our YouTube channel. We will be looking at these 4 strategic pointers around the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese transformative technology and innovation capacity, the internationalization of Chinese non-governmental actors, and China's growing influence on the multilateral governance system. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to join our Scanning China Futures Resources group, please get in touch with me. Our theme next year for the community will be looking at the interconnectedness of global trends. So again, you can find out more on our website or contacting us. But thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Bertram.